Hi, ladies. This is CC8 booklet and it's PowerPoint 8, which is on government intervention to promote competition and contestability. Now, if you remember, we talked about contestability when we were looking at the issues around that we discussed in CC5, which was where the government was trying to encourage and promote competition to avoid oligopolies or monopolies from exploiting their market position. So this is a bit more detail on that particular area, and some of it will be a refresher, hopefully. But again, if we take a look at the information that's provided in your booklet, CC8, from page 68 onwards, talks about the regulatory frameworks that the government puts in place in order to try to promote competition and contestability. And there's a range of different things that they have done and are constantly doing to try to address that issue. So let's take a look at these slides and see where we go. So we're going to be looking at, as I mentioned, government intervention to promote competition and contestability. Again, that shouldn't be a huge surprise to you in terms of some of the content that only won't be a huge surprise to you. Some of the content that we're going to discuss in here, because we have touched on it when we were looking specifically at monopoly and oligopoly as market structures. So let's take a look then at some of the things that the government might choose to do to promote competition and contestability. The first one is enhancing. So what are they attempting to do? Well, they're trying to enhance competition between firms through the promotion of small business. Okay, so in some instances they will do that. Well, clearly, if you think about it, if you encourage small businesses to be more competitive, then that's going to enhance competition, and then that's going to give greater choice and hopefully better prices for the market. They also look at competition policy, and we'll take a look at some of the competition policy options that they've got to choose from to help try and address some of these issues. They'll also look at either deregulation or the regulatory framework that can attempt to control and manage particular organisations and particular market sectors. So that's another thing that they can do to try to address some of these issues. There were also competitive tendering for government contracts is something that they will certainly consider. And there are a number of other options like privatising industry. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. And again, from page 69 onwards, there's quite a lot of content that will help you to understand in your booklets. So please have a read through some of that information as you're going through this PowerPoint. There are significant amounts of information in the booklet which will help you, and also some case studies to help you to be able to maybe quote them, use them in order to demonstrate your understanding when you come to answering exam-based questions. So competition policy then, first thing, okay? So what is it all about? It's basically about trying to make economic decisions where they're designed, the main aim is designed to try and make goods markets more competitive. Okay, so it includes policies towards monopoly, mergers, and restrictive trading practices. Okay, so remember, we've said about this principle about exploiting your monopoly position within a market. So competition policy is basically designed to prevent that exploitation of monopoly power, maybe reducing cost of production, removing barriers to entry and exit, and all of those things which might separate markets to some degree. Three different strands of UK competition policy, and the three are monopoly policy, merger policy, restrictive trade practices. Those are the three key areas. Mainly, those are delivered by the Competition and Markets Authority. But and to some degree, that competition policy was influenced very, very significantly, actually, by the EU. But obviously, that's become far less important now that Brexit has happened, or will become less so. So, taking a look at some of the information that you've got on page 69, which talks about the CMA, talks about its functions, talks about the power that it might have, also talks about mergers and takeovers. There's some quite good information on page 69 for you to have a read through and highlight the bits that you think are going to be most relevant when it comes to trying to answer questions on this particular area. Now, clearly, we talked about some of the issues around the problems of monopolies, and there's some quite good notes on in the Powell booklet in the 4th edition from page 260 to 266. So that again would be useful to have a look through and make sure you're taking notes on those and adding those to your booklets too. Some options that they can consider, the government can consider. They could compulsorily break up all monopolies. Okay, it might sound a bit draconian, but it's something that they could choose to do should they want to. They could choose to use some sort of price controls to restrict monopoly abuse. Okay, we've looked at the use of price controls, both in terms of minimum and maximum pricing, but certainly the government might choose to approach this by managing and controlling price, regulating price, if you like, to stop the abuse of monopoly positions. Another way they might choose to do that is to tax monopoly profits more heavily, almost applying a windfall tax, and that's something that they're clearly considering based on the pandemic and some of these large businesses that have made significant gains during that time and are going to be maybe taxed more heavily than those that haven't made as significant a profit. It could also use what's known as rate of return regulations. So clearly, if an organisation is making 20% on all of its assets, for instance, all of the things, all of its activities, or maybe it's a higher level, they might actually be subjected to, this is the maximum rate of return that we are going to allow you to make, and any extras over and above that you will be paying to the government in some sort of windfall tax. Oh, excuse me. The other alternative is to maybe look at state ownership and monopoly. In some cases, there might be it might be in the public interest to take the state to take ownership of a monopoly organisation. But on the flip side of that, the other way in which you could address that is to privatise monopolies. Okay, so you basically bring in market forces, and also by privatising monopolies, then basically they become much more driven by profit and efficiency, and that in some cases might actually improve the overall efficiency of that market and certainly the allocation of resources. Other options: deregulation or removal of barriers to entry. Again, if we've got a non-contestable market, i.e., that is very difficult for organisations to come into the new markets, it may well be that there will be some deregulation, or there may be removals of barriers to entry from markets in order to try to bring in competition and to stimulate more competition within a market. There could be some merger policies to avoid monopolies being formed in the future. And obviously the CMA, as we've talked about before, have a significant role to play in that, in terms of if an organisation is merging and is actually going to hold a very high level of market power, that might actually be either investigated, and in some cases it might actually be blocked too. Think about Sainsbury's and Asda as an example in the supermarket sector. The other thing that the government might consider is some sort of restricted trading practices policy as well, and that's something that we'll take a look at in a bit more detail as we go through this presentation. So there's quite a nice activity for you to do here based on this government CMA cases. I'd like you to take a look, and this will be really useful for you should you have to answer a question on this sort of sector. I'd like you to research a merger or takeover that was referred to the CMA, and you can do that by looking on that government website, gov.uk/CMA-cases. produce a short PowerPoint, and you can present that to the class or present that to some of your classmates. Look at the date of the investigation, when it was announced, what was the nature of the deal, and what was the reason for the competition concerns, what sort of monetary value was the potential deal, and what was the CMA's decision. So we talked about Sainsbury's and Asda as an example, but maybe take a look. You can obviously have that one as one that you could use, but also take a look at another one or two, so that you've got that in your locker should you need to answer a question of this nature in exam-based situations. Let's take a look at the next area then: public ownership, privatisation, regulation and deregulation of markets. So one of the things that they might consider is the promotion of small businesses. Why? What's the point of that? Well, if we think about how important they are, small and medium-sized businesses, SMEs as they're known, provide 60% of all jobs and 50% of all GDP in the UK. So clearly they are a very important area for the government to try to stimulate, okay? Because clearly small firms tend to have to be more innovative. New firms can actually challenge some of the existing firms, and so that's going to hopefully encourage and increase the levels of competitiveness. Clearly the government is very, very keen to encourage this innovative new startup culture to try to, number one, improve efficiencies, number two, improve and innovate on products and services provided, and number three, give some challenge to the existing status quo, who might be just satisficing, for want of a better term. So that's clearly one thing to bear in mind. Another thing that we can consider, and again I've tried to use in this booklet and also in the slides, examples that you can consider, okay? So there's a case study on the UK energy industry that you can take a look at, dominated by big six energy companies. That might tell you something about the market structure. Significant barriers to entry. What can the government do? Well, it might bring in a regulator, and as a result of that, that might then mean that they will dictate what those organisations can charge, for instance. Okay, so clearly in this case there is a case to answer, and again more information that you can take a look at, which provides you with exactly the sort of information that will help you to be able to answer a question on this as an issue. How can the government help with small businesses then? Well, it can help with a number of different ways. It could lower the rate of corporation tax to encourage and incentivise levels of profit being made, and obviously that will then hopefully mean that organisations will then invest more money in the future and try to improve the overall success of the organisation. Another thing the government might choose to do is to provide VAT relief for small businesses, for instance. They could maybe act as a guarantor for bank loans if they're bankrolling a particular organisation, or they might also encourage public sector bodies to give business to small firms. So there's a number of things that the government can do to sort of pump prime as far as that's concerned, to try to stimulate successful small businesses. Other areas that they can consider, the government will consider and are using on a fairly regular basis, something known as deregulation, which again I think you're probably familiar with, but that basically means taking away imposed regulations that might have adversely restricted competition and freedom of market activity. So clearly that's designed to try to encourage organisations and competition into previously highly regulated and possibly nationalised industries. So, for instance, the government has removed protected legal monopoly status in a number of different sectors: bus companies, airlines, the Royal Mail, TV, radio, etc., etc. Okay, so the idea is to try to encourage private industry to come into those previously monopoly-driven nationalised industries, and trying to actually get the benefits of competition in terms of more choice for consumers, better prices, and also clearly the need for organisations to battle and compete with other organisations in order to be successful. Other things that again can be done by the government, they might lower barriers to entry, they might provide low cost finance for new entrants, reducing barriers to entry such as import restrictions, licensing and legal requirements, and specifically employment law, in order to try to encourage more people, more organisations to get involved in markets where maybe they haven't been as efficient in allocating resources because there hasn't been competition in those markets previously. Again, brilliant example, the Royal Mail, and there have definitely been exam-based questions. I think we might have actually had a go at answering one of those in one of our 15 markers during year one. But again, the Royal Mail were originally a government-owned nationalised industry, and over time they've tried to bring in competition and try to encourage innovation, and that culminated in the Royal Mail being privatised back in 2013. Okay, it's a very good case study for you to consider. And again, there is more information in your booklets on this whole area and the Royal Mail specifically, but it's something that I would like you to go and have a little look at, and again, so that you've got that in your portfolio of tools to be able to then say, well, if you did have a question on mail delivery or had to talk about an organisation that had been privatised and some of the advantages and disadvantages of privatisation, that would be a very good one to base it on. What are some of the advantages of deregulation then? Well, clearly increased competition should improve efficiency, should lead to lower costs and to lower prices for consumers. And more often than not, the government regulation often involves excessive costs of bureaucracy. So if you deregulate, then clearly there's an awful lot of saving of time to be achieved too. Some of the disadvantages of deregulation, though, in some cases, we could argue that it's quite difficult to create effective competition in an industry if it's a natural monopoly because of the high barriers to entry, and in some cases deregulation might actually create a private firm with monopoly power, which clearly would be causing, well, essentially would be government failure as far as that's concerned, because it wouldn't be achieving what the original objective of deregulation was. In some cases as well, deregulation can lead to compromise of public services with poorer quality provision, where a private company might choose to cut corners in order to make more profit. That may not necessarily be the way in which the government would like that particular service or that particular product to be produced and provided. Again, examples are being used very significantly here. We just talked about a couple of examples. One was the energy industry, the other was the Royal Mail, and here we've also got the deregulation of the bus market. Okay, so there is an article in your booklet for you to read on that specific example. And I'm just going to find you the page number for that. So that is regulation we've talked about. Energy cap we've also mentioned, but there are on page 77. There's a bunch of stuff on that. But there are significant amounts of information throughout your booklet talking about some of these issues and obviously applying it to, in this case, the deregulation of the bus market. Okay, so there's an article for you to read, and I'd like you to have a go at answering the questions. So, to what extent has privatisation and deregulation improved contestability and efficiency in the UK's local bus market? And also, a supplementary question there: does the evidence suggest the need for new regulation as proposed by the Competition Commission, now part of the CMA? So, the next thing to bear in mind then is competitive tendering for government contracts. That's another thing that the government might try to do in order to try and stimulate competition. So, in this instance, in some cases, if some of these services might be state provided, or they might be subsidised, and in some cases, the private sector may not necessarily provide those in the way in which we would like them to. So, in that scenario, what the organisation would do, or what the government would do, is it would actually encourage people within the market to apply for those tenders, and it may actually, in some cases, provide not so much incentives, but they may look on other companies as more in a more favourable way in order to give them the opportunity to compete. Okay, so in some cases they might choose to contract out. Okay, so they might get private sector firms to come in and produce the goods and services, and then they then provide those services for the state, for its citizens. And competitive tendering is also something that the government will try and encourage in some cases. So, trying to encourage competition amongst private sector firms and putting bids out for work which can be contracted out by the public sector. So that's something that, again, the government will try to do, but they'll also consider competitive tendering for government contracts. And we've just gone through this process of drawing up the tendering process. So the government draws up a specification, invites private sector companies to bid for that contract, and then the firm with the offering the best price, subject to quality guarantees, will win the contract. Okay, so in terms of some of the advantages and disadvantages of that contracting out process, I'd like you to give some thought to that. There is also on page 89 of your booklet a little bit more information on competitive tendering, and also I'd like you to do a little bit of research into some of the organisations that the government has contracted services out to. Again, I don't think you need to look at all of them, but there are a couple of quite interesting ones that you might like to consider, Serco being one, Carillion being another, and Capita being another. And I mentioned some of those articles previously on deregulation of the bus market. That's on page 88 in your booklet. So when you come to take a look at that and answer those questions on deregulation, that is on page 87 and 88. So advantages and disadvantages of deregulation, and also the article on the deregulation of the bus market. Okay. So, competitive tendering then, okay, advantages and disadvantages. Again, if you take a look at your booklets, there is information on this area, but also I'd like you to give some thoughts as to how successful they might be. Consider some advantages and disadvantages, and also consider the limitations, okay? So there's information here which will help you to consider those some of those issues. Okay, so there's a link for you to take a look at. There's a couple of Newsnight clips as well, talking about some of the issues around contracting out and whether that's a good thing or not, and particularly where some of these UK government contracts have been awarded to organisations that maybe haven't quite done what they should have done in terms of being efficient in their use of resources. Other examples, again, take a look at that whistleblower example that we just talked about and just showed on the previous slide. But also, in terms of this principle of outsourcing probation services as an example, there's a news report that you can take a look at, and also that will help you to hopefully understand a little bit more about that whole process. And look at arguments for and arguments against this issue in terms of outsourcing probation services. Okay, so the next thing we're going to take a look at then is this principle of privatisation, okay, and nationalisation too. Okay, so one is it's sort of the opposite to the other. But basically, privatisation is the transfer of a business, industry, or service from public to private ownership control. And nationalisation is essentially the opposite to that. So, transfer of firms or assets from private sector ownership into state ownership. There are arguments for privatisation and there are arguments against, as you could imagine. And dependent on the colour of your politics and the view as to whether privatisation is a good thing or nationalisation is a good thing, there are a range of arguments in favour of privatisation. Obviously, it encourages promotion, promotes competition. Excuse me. It can be quite productively efficient or more productively efficient and reduces inefficiency. It gives more choice and quality, or can do. It can mean that more innovation comes into the market, and so assuming a monopoly is in a scenario where it's actually making supernormal profits, it might choose to become dynamically efficient and try to improve the whole process. One could argue that that also provides a better resource allocation in that the market actually decides on the way in which resources are going to be allocated. And in some instances, obviously, there are a number of things. Privatisation can help to achieve wider share ownership, so popular capitalism as it's known. It can also reduce the public sector borrowing and state spending, because essentially when an organisation comes out of nationalised control into privatised control, the government basically gets paid, or the shares that are issued in that particular organisation means that the money that is generated by that privatisation can be used for other activities. Now, in your booklet on page 91, there are some examples of privatisation cases, and you can see that during the the very late 70s and into the early 80s and through to the 90s, and that there are a significant number of organisations that have been previously owned by the government and nationalised that have now become private sector organisations. There's the case against privatisation. Again, take a look on page 269 in Powell, 4th edition. Some notes on monopoly abuse. This again is something that we've talked about, this principle of exploiting your market position and your dominant market position. Short-termism winning over long-termism. Okay, so if you privatise, then the danger is that the short-term view might be that the shareholders want to get a decent return, so we'll take that view and we'll try and provide them short-term gains rather than doing the better thing for the organisation in terms of sustainable development, of taking the long-term view. But again, take a look on page 269. Each of those areas are quite nicely covered by the booklet. The other thing that we talked about was Royal Mail privatisation, and we talked about that briefly, but there is quite a nice, again, couple of articles on page 92 in your booklet talking about Royal Mail privatisation, and it is basically a data response question. Okay, so you've got extracts to read, and then I'd like you to fill in the table: advantages of Royal Mail privatisation and the disadvantages of Royal Mail privatisation. So that there, as you can see, as we're going through this, I'm trying to give you lots of examples within the booklet, in your CC8 booklet, and also some quite significant amounts of information provided that you just need to read through within your booklet. Okay. So other things to bear in mind: restrictions on monopsony power of firms. We talked about this on numerous occasions, and there have been a couple of fairly major examples that are included, which really look at the Office of Fair Trading, and whether in some cases maybe that organisations are being asked to come up with a voluntary code, if you like, in terms of a code of practice, in order that that this competition is brought in, so that we're looking at delivering good deals for our consumers. And so this principle of monopsony power, where supermarkets hold a significant power over their suppliers, how might that be addressed? What sort of things could the government do to try to stimulate that process? And it might be a voluntary code, but clearly what we want to try and do is make sure that rather than that monopsony power being exploited, and remember we looked at that when in CC5, I think, where we looked at issues around Holland and Barrett and Premier Foods, who were pretty much riding roughshod over some of their suppliers in order to exploit their market position. So that's privatisation. The thing that we also need to consider is nationalisation. And again, it's, if you like, if you read, if you take the opposite view of privatisation, nationalisation is where you basically transfer firms or assets from the private sector into state ownership. Okay, now there are some reasons and some positive reasons for doing that. Again, take a look on page 96. You've got arguments for and arguments against nationalisation, and in some cases whether there would be advantages. Where there's natural monopolies, it probably is an advantage to look at possibly looking at state ownership. But in this instance, nationalised industries and public corporations are considered to be state-owned industries or companies. Okay. Now, the one issue is that private monopoly generally assumes that organisations that are in private monopoly positions tend to maximise profit, and that can lead to inefficient levels of output. Okay, so if we're talking about nationalisation, then the view would be not for it to be just about profit maximisation. The goals of the firm might actually be shifted to say, well, actually, you've got to provide maximum social welfare, not private profit, as an example. Okay, and in some cases there are some very good reasons why that might happen. Arguments for nationalisation, and these are listed in your booklet on page 96. I'm not going to read through each one, but there is quite a nice revision presentation from Tutor to You, which is linked here on the slide down here, so go and take a look at that in full presentation mode, and you should be able to, that link will work for you. But they range from lower costs to better management, better control of monopolies, certainly maximising net social benefit and not private profit. Maybe the government has more control over unstable market economies, for instance, and it may well lead to a fairer distribution of resources from owners to workers and consumers. Okay, so those are some of the arguments for. Maybe what we need to consider are some of the arguments against, and that's probably going to need a little bit of discussion on your part and a little bit of research on your part too to try and suss that one out. So the next thing then, in terms of the other areas and other activities that you've got to consider, there's some articles on the argument for and against renationalisation of railways, and also would nationalised trains be better? So it's something to bear in mind. Okay, now in this instance, we've got to think about what the limitations of government intervention might be. Okay, so here's an example on private water companies making £1 billion from unnecessarily high prices. So to what extent can Ofwat have they been successful in regulating the water industry? Well, one could argue that they've not been particularly successful. Also, thinking about some of these questions, asymmetric information and regulatory capture, and also other examples. In this case, BT rallying forces to battle for open reach and internet provision, broadband in particular. So again, some decent set of questions for you to consider based on some of the examples that have been given in your booklet. Okay. So clearly, one of the issues that we need to bear in mind is some of these issues. If the government tries to intervene and then fails, what is it that they can do about that? Okay. Now, mentioning both the previous slide where we looked at the private water companies, the articles for you to take a look at are on page 103 in your booklet. Okay, and then the BT rallies forces for battle is page 104. Okay, so again, good examples, relatively current examples of information on a change in private water companies and also for BT as far as the internet and broadband is concerned. So again, those articles will help you to be able to answer the questions that are being posed on the slides here. Okay, what I'd like you to consider is the advantages of splitting Openreach from BT to form a separate company, and then also evaluating the disadvantages of that, and using the articles that have been given to you in your booklet. Okay, so hopefully that will make sense in terms of the overall evaluation of regulation. What do you think the benefits and limitations of regulation are? And again, what I've tried to do again is to try to structure your thought process so that you might do a little bit of research, understand the content and understand some case studies, and then be able to apply some of these benefits but also the limitations of regulation in terms of that encouraging more competition and as part of government competition policy. So that concludes that slide presentation, and there's just one more to do, which looks specifically at the way in which organisations and specifically the government looks at where government failure happens. What are some of the issues that we need to bear in mind when we come to look at that? Okay, so thanks once again, and we'll catch up very soon.